Welcome to Christ in Me with Addie podcast. I'm your host, Addie Overla, and I am so glad that you're here. Whether you're new to Jesus or you've been walking with Jesus for a while, or you're not sure about this whole faith in Jesus and life thing, I'm so glad that you're here. Because here on this podcast, we have real conversations about really big questions about faith and life from the lens and perspective of the Bible. And if you're not sure what you believe, you don't have to believe to be a part of what we're doing here on Christ in Me with Addie podcast. This is a safe space to join in these conversations, figure out where God might be leading you, and figure out what kind of relationship you have with Him. I can't wait to get into it with you guys, but be sure to follow me over on Instagram at Addie Overla and join the Christ in Me with Addie broadcast channel to stay up to date on all things with the podcast. Now let's get into today's topic. Hey guys, and welcome back to Christ in Me with Addie. If you're tuning in on YouTube, my dog just walked up and decided she's going to be a part of today's episode. So if you hear panting in the background, that would be her. Anyways, welcome. I'm glad that you guys are here. Whether it's your first time listening to Christ in Me with Addie or you've been a part of this podcast community for a while, I just want to remind you that you are deeply loved and seen by God. And I feel like sometimes we just need to hear that, right? We just need a reminder. God loves you so much and He sees you. And if you clicked on this episode, my heart just goes out to you because there's something that you're wrestling with. There's something that you're struggling with. And so hopefully by the end of this episode, you feel some peace. But helping you realize that is truly my heart and hope for this podcast, that you're deeply loved and seen by God. So do me a favor and take 3 minutes to just leave a review if you haven't yet about this podcast and how God has met you through this podcast. Hit subscribe so that this podcast is always notifying you when there's a new episode. I know these things might seem small to you guys and, maybe you're like, maybe I'll do it later or, what will my review really do? But the thing is, as insignificant as it might seem, this helps get the podcast out there and in the hands of more people who need the hope of Jesus. I've shared this before, but it was one video during COVID that I saw that kind of changed my thought about church and got me back into a church and then changed the course of my life from that moment forward. And so that's why I do social media ministry, because I know how one video can impact somebody's life and God might want to do something through that one video or through your one review that somebody else sees that helps them hear the message of Jesus today. So please take time to do that if you are willing. And I'm not going to lie in saying reading your reviews and getting your messages over on my Instagram at Addie Overla is so encouraging to me and honestly helps me keep going on hard days when I need some encouragement too, or on my creative writing block days when I ask God, is there anyone out there really being impacted by what we're doing here? It helps me to stay encouraged too. So if you have time, just take a little time today to leave a review, to hit subscribe, to follow over on Instagram or YouTube. With all that being said, I just wanted to share a story from the Bible that recently really met me in life and inspired this topic that we're going to talk about today. This is a Bible story that I've read time and time again, but for some reason, this time it hit so different. God met me in a really fresh and new way. So before I share that story, I just want to say, like I said earlier, you clicked on this episode topic for a reason. I'm not sure what in life has you feeling like you're drowning, but I do think God is going to meet you in the same way that He met me with this story. I know sometimes life can just feel really overwhelming, like you're barely keeping your head above water and you're just not sure how to move forward or honestly, if you're even going to make it. But today I want to share a message from Scripture that I believe can bring peace and hope to your heart. So context to this story, we're going to talk about Matthew chapter 14 and where we're picking up in this story. If you want to grab your Bibles and pull up Matthew 14, we're going to kind of go like line by line a little bit. But Matthew 14, context of this story, Jesus just performed a miracle, and this is what we commonly call the feeding of the 5,000. This is where Jesus is preaching. He goes a couple days, I'm pretty sure, if I'm remembering the story correctly, and he only had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish that he borrowed from someone. Jesus multiplies this food to feed those in need because a lot of them had traveled from very far lands and it would be dangerous for them to try to travel super hungry. So Jesus cared for these people and he knew I needed to do something. So with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, Jesus multiplied the food to feed a crowd of 5,000. And something crazy to keep in mind, it's not really relevant to what we're going to talk about today, but I just love that story, is that back in those days, the counting of the 5,000 would have been just men. So if you add women and children, we're talking probably 10 to 15,000 people that Jesus actually fed with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus is amazing. So I don't know what has you feeling like you're drowning today, but if you're feeling short on money, if you're feeling short on patience, if you're feeling short on love in your life, if you're feeling short on peace, Jesus wants to multiply what little you have into something abundant and overflowing. So carrying on in the story, Jesus just performed this miracle, and he asks the disciples to start traveling to their next destination while he took some time to himself to pray. So the disciples loaded into their boat and they started on their way. So we're going to pick up in verse 24, and it says, meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble Meanwhile, I already botched it, guys. Okay, verse 24. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. Verse 25, about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. Verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." So to kind of put perspective to this story, picture this. You just watched Jesus perform this crazy miracle. He sends you on your way. You're in a boat. It's 3 a.m. You're scared for your life because insane wind, waves, this insane storm comes out of nowhere. Rain is absolutely pelting you in your face. There's thunder and lightning. Waves are crashing up against the boat, and ocean spray is getting into your eyes and your mouth, like salt water is stinging your eyes. You're doing your best to keep your balance and stay afloat while you're also worrying about your friends who are also in this boat, hoping that they don't get suddenly thrown into open water. And then out in the distance, in the middle of all of this, you see a figure walking on the water in the middle of the open water, walking towards you. Every flash of lightning that lights up this figure for a split second sends chills down your spine. But little did the disciples know that the figure that was coming towards them was Jesus, and he was coming to rescue them. He wasn't some scary, horror movie figure that was going to come eat them and sink them down into the water. So in verse 27, the story continues. But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Do not be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." If there was this shadowy apparition in front of you in the middle of the water and they were like, "Don't be afraid," would you believe it? I wonder if the disciples had trouble making out Jesus's voice, hearing his voice and recognizing, "Oh, that's Jesus, guys, we're fine," But Jesus tries to reassure them that he is there to save them. But the disciples are so spooked. And honestly, I would be too. I'm very jumpy. I don't even like horror movies because then I have to walk around my house and run from one room to the next because I think something's going to get me, even though I'm perfectly safe. So Peter in the Bible, he's well known for kind of being bold and kind of just sort of speaking his mind, not in a rude way or an arrogant way, but just honestly in kind of a curious way. He just felt comfortable with Jesus and he would just kind of say anything. So Peter yells out over the wind and the waves and the thunder and the lightning. Verse 28, Peter says, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." That's crazy. I've prayed to Jesus before and been like, "God, if it's really you, just make it really clear to me. Just make it really, really clear." But I can honestly admit I've never prayed to Jesus in moments where I'm trying to discern if something's actually from him or not. I've never prayed and been like, "God, if it's really you, just let me walk on water right now and I'll know that it's you." Or, "God, if it's really you, let me stand in front of this bus right now. And if I don't get hurt, I'll know that it's you." That's pretty much the weight of what Peter was saying, because to step into the water at this during this storm would have been certain death. Like you would have been carried out to sea and inevitably drowned to death. So hey there, friend. We're taking a brief pause from today's episode so I can tell you about something that I just launched that I'm so excited about. So in addition to the podcast, I have so many other just loves and hobbies, and one is cooking. And I just launched my digital food diary that's available as a digital version. And in this digital food diary, you get over 30 recipes. If you're a busy mom on the go, if you're a 9-to-5 girly, or even if you're in school, or even if you're in high school and you're like, I just want to learn how to cook healthy, nutritious, but comforting meals for myself, this cookbook is for you. You can access it down below in the show notes, but I have gluten-free options. They're focused on high protein, but high nutrients. So there's a lot of hidden veggies for those who just hate chicken, rice, and vegetables. I take classic comfort foods, but turn them into healthier versions so you can still get foods that you love without all of the calories. Fitness and nutrition is a huge passion of mine. And if you're looking to start your journey this year, if you're that mom who just doesn't know what to make for dinner this week, grab a copy of my digital food diary because it was made with love to help you make food with love for the ones that you love. Now back to the episode. Can you imagine this? I'm not sure what has you feeling like you're drowning, but imagine you are literally in a boat sinking and you say, Jesus, if it's really you, let me walk on the water to you. That's like being trapped at the top of a roller coaster, seeing Jesus up on a cloud and being like, if it's really you, let me unbuckle myself and fly over to you. You know, that's just, I don't know if I'd ever be that bold. So this shows that Peter had strong faith, but also like a pretty crazy amount of confidence. So verse 29, Jesus says, yes, come. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. Verse 30, but when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. Save me, Lord, he shouted. Can you picture this right now? Peter had to have some strong faith to trust that if he threw himself into the water and stepped over the edge of the boat, you know, and they've been fighting not falling over the edge of the boat till 3 a.m. We don't know what time the disciples left Jesus and how long they'd been in the boat. But what we do know is that they'd been fighting this storm all night long. And then Peter just walks off the boat, just, decides to step on over the edge. But he had some crazy faith to do that and trust that he wouldn't drown. But something really interesting to notice about this story, despite his crazy faith, Peter took his eyes off of Jesus. It says in verse 30 that when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. It was when he took his eyes off of Jesus that he began to sink. Peter focused on the situation and the circumstances instead of keeping his eyes on Jesus, and that's what caused him to sink. Again, I don't know what caused you to click on this episode or what you're facing right now. Maybe right now you're feeling like you're drowning because of your financial situation. Maybe you feel like you're just absolutely drowning in debt and there's no way out, and slowly this is going to suffocate you. Maybe right now you feel like you're drowning because of the relationships in your life. Maybe your marriage is in a terrible spot. Maybe there's tension with your family members, your parents, your friends, your coworkers, and the situation is just so heavy it feels like water is filling in your chest. Maybe right now you feel like you're drowning because your mental health is just down the drain. You are in a battle with your mental health and anxiety and depression, and each wave and each pelt of rain is just taking the fight out of you, and you don't know how much longer you can keep trying to keep your head afloat through the storms of life. I don't know what has you feeling like you're drowning, but what I do know is that Jesus doesn't want you to drown. He always shows up in the storms of life, and he is always on time to rescue us. Even when it feels like you're on the brink of absolutely sinking and losing it all, he's there and he sees you. The story continues in verse 31, and it says, remember, Peter had just cried out and said, "Save me, Lord." Verse 31, it says, immediately Jesus reached out and grabbed him. "You of little faith," Jesus said, "why did you doubt me?" You see, Jesus wasn't mad at him. Jesus wasn't disappointed in him. Jesus wasn't saying, Peter, you have such little faith. Like, what are you doing? Jesus was saying, Peter, you've seen everything that I've done so far. You've walked alongside me. You've seen how far I've brought you. You know that I can multiply fishes and loaves. You know that I can heal the blind. Why would you allow your faith to doubt me now? Verse 32, it says, when they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Verse 33, then the disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. The reason I want to share this story with you and kind of why this story was so different this time that I read it is because the story is just such a beautiful reminder that the storms of life and feeling like we're drowning, that's not evidence that Jesus isn't with us. That's not evidence that he isn't in the room. That's not evidence that he's far from us. That's not evidence that we've done something wrong. It's not evidence that we're being punished by God. But instead, it's a defining moment for our faith. We have two options in the situation of drowning and sinking. The first is to doubt, sink, and completely exhaust ourselves and allow ourselves to succumb to our situation. And I know I've definitely been guilty of that so many times. Like, my survival instinct kicks in. I'm like, what can I do in my strength and my power to save myself right now? But then there's another option. The second option is to yell out, "Lord, save me," like Peter did, to lift up our hands to him. And scripture says that he will immediately rescue us. I think sometimes when we feel like we're drowning, we look at the wind and the waves instead of keeping our eyes on Jesus. And the thing is, Peter did this too. We're only human. He was only human. We're only human. And this story is such a great reminder that keeping our eyes on Jesus is how we walk on and through the waves to him instead of sinking. I think the storms of life aren't evidence that Jesus isn't with us, but instead he wants to teach us how to walk through the storms of life to him for rescue. I heard this song recently that, in all honesty, I cannot listen to it without crying. And so I'm sorry that if you go and listen to it after this and it just completely wrecks your makeup today, because I promise you it will. But after you finish this episode, please, please, please go listen to this song, because you clicked on this episode and I feel like there's just something so healing about this song that almost like completes the idea of what I'm sharing here today. And actually the message that I'm sharing here today, this message from Matthew 14, it was actually inspired from this song. I was asked to lead this song for youth worship, and I was super honored, but they asked me to like prepare a really small speaking moment that could relate to the kiddos. And like what I'm sharing with you today is basically what I shared with them, just in a much more consolidated way. So this song, it's called "Always on Time" by Elevation Worship. And the lyrics say, I'm not going to sing it, but the lyrics say, "Jesus, I was tossed in the water, but I never went under. You were always on time." This song really made me think about the act of worship itself, like raising your hands in worship to God. And maybe you're from a denomination where that's super normal and you've raised your hands in worship 1,000 times, in like a public church setting. But maybe you're from a denomination where if you raised your hands in church, people would just like genuinely and weirdly think that you had a question. And I know that I've experienced both. Like, I was raised Catholic where you didn't really raise your hands in church and worship. And now I'm non-denominational where every Sunday I'm like full force, hands raised to God. And I just want to take a second, no matter what your background with raising your hands in worship looks like, what if we reframed how we think about worship? Maybe you've raised your hands in worship 1,000 times and it's really routine to you. Like it's super normal, almost even routine to where, it's lost its luster a little bit. Maybe you've never raised your hands in worship and that just feels really weird, which I can understand because the first time I raised my hands in worship, it was like a surrendering moment where I felt so much freedom, but it was also so much fear to I felt like I was making this public statement in church, which in a way you are, but it's also not about the people around you. It's about you and God. And so I just want to challenge you this week to lean in to worship and think about raising your hands to be saved from drowning like Peter did. What if this week during worship, you raised your hands in a way of saying, "Here I am, God, save me," like Peter did? What if whatever situation has you feeling like you're drowning, when you raised your hands in worship this week, you actually acted as though you were asking God to rescue you and pull you up out of the water? Maybe that looks like on a Sunday during church, reaching up to God in the midst of, I feel like I'm drowning, with the hope that He immediately wants to save you. Or maybe if you're not ready to do that publicly, or if you don't have the opportunity, what would it look like for you to go into the privacy of your room, put on a worship playlist, maybe even the song that I shared with you, and extend your hands up to God to just say, "Here I am," cry out to Him, "Lord, save me." What if you just tried that? Friend, I don't know why you clicked on this episode or what specific situation you're facing. But what I do know is that the heaviness and the weight that you're feeling in life is overwhelming you. You feel like you're drowning. Jesus wants to immediately rescue you. He's just waiting for you to cry out to Him like Peter. Maybe you feel like you've already done that. And you're like, "Addie, I've cried out to Him a million times and my situation isn't changing. I'm waiting and I wasn't rescued. What do I do now?" And that, I would ask you, are your eyes fixed more on the wind and the waves and the hardships and the challenges, or are your eyes fixed on Jesus? Sometimes He doesn't take away the storm. He wants us to walk through it to Him with our eyes fixed on Him. And there's a lesson to be learned there, and it's a lesson of love, but He's never going to let it overtake you. So if you feel like you've cried out and you're like, "God, rescue me," where are you? Are you more focused on the situation, or are your eyes fixed on Jesus? Because we know when Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, what happened? He sank. Whatever you're facing today, I hope you know that, like Peter, Jesus sees you. He's close by, and He's just waiting, like a life raft, for you to come to Him. I said this a little bit already, but notice how the storm that Peter was experiencing, it didn't calm until after Peter fixed his eyes on Jesus and built his faith to trust Him. Jesus didn't see he was drowning and instantly take away the storm. He waited until He knew Peter wanted rescuing from Him. And that's what I love about God is He doesn't force Himself on anyone. He wants to be wanted. That's something I love about God. Every hardship is always a lesson of love for our benefit. It grows and matures our faith even though it's hard. And sure, Jesus could take away every storm and prevent every disaster, but in all reality, would we still need Him? Would we still know Him? Would we still seek His power? Would we still cry out to Him? A question I would ponder today is, have I been fully desperate for Jesus? While I feel like I've been sinking, have I fully been desperate for Jesus, or have I been focusing more on the wind and the waves? Well, friend, I hope this episode brought you some peace. I know I just really needed to hear this message because there's a few things in life weighing super heavy on me right now. I feel like maybe I'm not drowning, but I definitely feel like I'm sinking in a few areas of life, and maybe you can relate. And it's something that I know I desperately need Jesus's help and rescue in, because I don't want to get to that drowning feeling. And so I just want to say thanks for being here. I hope that God met you through this episode, that you feel some encouragement, and that you feel like you have also a practical thing to just try this week. I hope that you'll try raising your hands in worship, viewing it as a rescue moment, and that you'll go listen to the song Always on Time by Elevation Worship right after this. I'll see you guys next time on Christ in Me with Addie.